Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
You know, usually when we study a medical problem, there is this expectation of precision, like engineering.
Oh yeah, like it's a math equation or something.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is.
Right, it's totally visible. It's just a binary state, broken or not broken.
Right. And that's comforting. You know, we like things to be clean and categorized, but then you step into the emergency department with a poisoned patient, and suddenly that x-ray machine is mostly useless.
Yeah, it's a completely murky diagnostic landscape. You're suddenly hunting for, like, invisible chemical hijackers.
Exactly. And that is why today, for you, the college student tackling pharmacology for the first time, we are doing a deep dive into the ultimate playbook for hunting those hijackers down. We're looking at Chapter 44 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Pharmacology.
That's such a great chapter. Clinical toxicology.
It really is. Our mission today is to move through this chapter in the exact order it's written. We're going to learn how to manage a poisoned patient from the moment they come through the door, figure out the mechanisms of famous toxins, and build an antidote cheat sheet.
And, you know, this isn't just some modern medical challenge. What's truly fascinating is how deeply poisons are woven into human history.
Oh, totally. I was looking at the historical background the book gives, and the name drops are wild. I mean, Homer and Aristotle describing poison arrows.
Right, and Socrates being executed with poison hemlock.
Yes. And there's even that theory that widespread lead poisoning might have helped bring down the entire Roman Empire.
Which is entirely plausible when you understand how lead acts on the brain.
Right.
But, I mean, whether we're talking about ancient Rome or tragic modern overdoses like Marilyn Monroe or Michael Jackson, the first question is always the same.
How did the toxin get into the body?
Exactly. The red of exposure.
And the chapter starts right off with figure 44.1, which paints this perfect mental picture for you. It's a diagram of a human body highlighting the four main doorways for toxins.
Yeah, so first, they can be inhaled, like smoke or carbon monoxide gas pulled into the lungs.
Or ingested, like swallowing pills.
Right. Third, they can be injected directly into the tissues or bloodstream with needles. And finally, dermal exposure.
Dermal meaning absorbed straight through the skin, right?
I got it.
Okay, so let's say a patient comes through those ER doors. The clock is ticking. You might not know which of those four doorways the poison used, and you might not even know what the poison is. Where do you start?
Well, you start by ignoring the poison.
Wait, really?
Yeah, I mean, for the first 5 minutes, yes. The central pharmacological tenet of this whole chapter is this: treat the patient, not the poison.
Treat the patient, not the poison. Okay, that's the golden rule.
Exactly. Before you can even worry about antidotes, you have to ensure the patient actually survives the immediate crisis. That means ABC's airway, breathing, circulation.
So addressing the life-threatening extremes first, like profound crashes in blood pressure or fatal heart arrhythmias.
Right. You stabilize the host first.
But what if they arrive completely unconscious? You've got an unresponsive patient, no friends around to tell you what happened. How do you stabilize a total mystery?
That's a critical scenario. Emergency medicine has a very specific empirical protocol for it. After giving oxygen, you consider giving them the coma cocktail.
The coma cocktail, they just love that term. It sounds like a system reboot for a crashed computer. Like you're covering the most immediate power failures first while you search for the virus.
That's a brilliant analogy. It's totally empirical, meaning we give it before we have the luxury of waiting for lab results. The coma cocktail has 3 specific intravenous ingredients. First, 5-E dextrose.
Because low blood sugar can mimic a toxic overdose.
Exactly. Hypoglycemia is a huge reversible cause of altered mental status. If their brain is just starving for sugar, dextrose wakes them up almost immediately.
Okay, what's the second ingredient?
Naloxone. This is the reversal agent for opioid toxicity, which suppresses breathing. It also works for a blood pressure med called clonidine.
Right. And the third ingredient?
Thiamine, which is vitamin B1. We give this specifically for ethanol-induced Wernicke encephalopathy.
Oh, so a severe brain disorder from chronic alcohol abuse.
Right. So you run the reboot, stabilize the vital signs, and buy yourself some time.
But once they're stable, the poison is still sitting inside them. The clock is still ticking on absorption.
It is. Which brings us to the next section, decontamination. The goal is to physically remove or trap the toxin before it hits the bloodstream.
Like washing chemicals off the skin or flushing eyes to a neutral pH?
Yeah, but if they swallowed it, we attempt gastrointestinal decontamination, ideally within 1 hour of ingestion. We could use gastric lavage, pumping the stomach, or whole bowel irrigation.
But the text says the most common tool is activated charcoal, right?
Yes, activated charcoal.
So we just pump them full of charcoal and it absorbs the poison like a sponge.
Well, not exactly. It doesn't absorb it. It absorbs it with a D.
Oh, wait. Adsorbs. What is the difference?
Absorption is when a substance fully enters the volume of another, like water into a kitchen sponge. Adsorption is when molecules physically bind to the surface of a material.
I see.
And activated charcoal is incredibly porous. Just a handful has the surface area of a football field.
That's wild. So it's more like a molecular sponge covered in Velcro. The drug molecules drift by in the stomach, stick to the Velcro surface of the charcoal, and safely pass through the digestive tract.
That's a highly accurate mental model.
Yeah.
But, and this is a massive caveat in the text, it does not work for everything.
Really? I always thought charcoal was like the universal neutralizer.
It's a common misconception. Charcoal is carbon-based, so it binds well to large organic molecules. But it is useless against heavy metals like lead or iron.
Oh, wow. Good to know.
Yeah, and won't bind to lithium, potassium, or alcohols like methanol and ethanol either.
Okay, so if someone drank antifreeze, charcoal won't help. But what if we miss that 1 hour window anyway? What if the drug is already absorbed into the blood?
Then we shift to elimination enhancement. We force the body to excrete the toxin faster. One method is hemodialysis.
Which is running the blood through a machine. But you can't dialyze everything, right?
Far from it. A drug only dialyzes if it has a small molecular weight, a small volume of distribution, is highly water-soluble, and has low protein binding.
So if it's tightly hugged by blood proteins, the filter can't pull it out.
Exactly. Drugs that do fit the profile include methanol, ethylene glycol, salicylates, and lithium.
What if dialysis isn't an option?
Yeah, then we use urinary alkalinization. We basically trap the drug inside the urine.
Wait, trap it? How do you physically trap a chemical in urine?
Well, many drugs can shift between an ionized state, meaning it carries an electrical charge, and a non-ionized, uncharged state.
Okay, tracking.
The kidney is a filter. If a drug in the urine is non-ionized, it can easily slip right back through the kidney walls into the bloodstream. But if it is ionized, it gets stuck. It can't cross the membrane back into the blood.
Oh, I see. So we force the drug to take on a charge and it gets locked in.
Precisely. We manipulate the urine pH using IV sodium bicarbonate, raising the pH to around 7.5 or 8.0. This alkaline environment forces weak acids, like salicylates or phenobarbital, to become highly ionized.
That is so cool. I picture it like putting a bulky winter coat on the drug molecule. Normally it's skinny enough to slip back through the kidney walls into the blood.
Yeah.
But then you throw this bulky ionized winter coat on it and suddenly it's too big and clumsy to slip through the exit, so it just gets flushed down the drain.
That's the perfect way to visualize ion trapping.
Is there any other way to pull a drug out of the blood?
Just one more. Multiple dose activated charcoal. Figure 44.2 in the chapter shows this beautifully.
Okay. But wait, earlier you said charcoal only works in the stomach before it gets absorbed.
Usually, yes. But if we give multiple doses, we create a massive concentration of empty charcoal in the gut. Basic chemistry says substances move from high concentration to low concentration.
Ah, so the drug diffuses backward, out of the blood and back into the gut.
Exactly. It crosses the intestinal wall back into the gut where the fresh charcoal traps it. Plus, this interrupts enterohepatic recirculation.
Let's pause there for the listener. What is enterohepatic recirculation?
It's a loop. Normally, the liver filters a drug, dumps it into the bile, and sends it to the intestines to be pooped out. But some drugs, like phenytoin, get to the intestines and just absorb right back into the blood.
Like a toxic merry-go-round. The liver throws it out, the intestines bring it right back in.
Yeah. But constant charcoal in the gut catches it and breaks the cycle. Now, I have to give a huge clinical warning here. You must check for bowel sounds before every single dose.
Why? What happens if you don't?
If the GI tract has stopped moving, which toxins often cause, and you keep pumping in thick charcoal, you'll create a cement-like bowel obstruction.
Yikes. Definitely a critical safety check. Okay, so we've covered the general playbook. Let's look at specific culprits, starting with the most common over-the-counter drug, acetaminophen or Tylenol.
Yeah, so figure 44.3 diagrams this. Acetaminophen is a fascinating study in normal physiology getting overwhelmed. Normally, the liver safely metabolizes it. but a tiny fraction becomes a highly dangerous metabolite called NAPQI.
NAPQI, that sounds nasty.
It is extremely toxic to liver cells, but thankfully, your liver produces a protective substance called glutathione. Glutathione immediately binds the NAPQI and neutralizes it.
So glutathione is like a nightclub bouncer, and NAPQI is a rowdy guest. A few rowdy guests, the bouncers escort them out easily.
Exactly, but in an overdose, you send thousands of rowdy guests in at once. The liver depletes all its glutathione, the bouncers are knocked out, now the NAPQI is unchecked, and it destroys liver cells from the inside out.
What does that actually look like for the patient? I imagine liver failure hurts.
It's actually deceptive. Figure 44.4 breaks it into 4 phases. Phase 1, the first 24 hours, they just feel gross. Nausea, malaise, they don't seem life-threatening.
Which is terrifying because they might just go to sleep thinking it's a stomach bug.
Right. But in phase 2, 24 to 72 hours, liver enzymes skyrocket and abdominal pain starts. Then phase 3 hits 72 to 96 hours. This is the danger zone. Liver necrosis, jaundice, death.
And phase 4?
Phase 4 is resolution and recovery, if they survive.
So how do we stop them from hitting phase 3? Can we restock the bouncers?
We can. The antidote is N-acetylcysteine, or NAC. It's a good glutathione substitute.
Sure.
But timing is everything. It works best within 8 to 10 hours.
So it's a race against the clock. How do ER docs know if they need to give it during that deceptive phase 1?
They use figure 44.5, the Rumack-Matthew nomogram. It's a graph plotting the blood acetaminophen level against the hours since ingestion. There's a diagonal danger line. If the patient's point lands above that line, you start NAC immediately.
I love that. Making the invisible visible. All right, let's move to the toxic alcohols.
Yeah.
Methanol windshield fluid and ethylene glycol antifreeze. Now, these aren't highly toxic on their own, right?
Right. The parent alcohols just cause CNS depression. You'd act very drunk. The lethal danger is what your own body turns them into. Figure 44.6 lays this out.
A total betrayal. How does it happen?
Your liver has an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. It oxidizes methanol into formic acid, which attacks the optic nerve and causes permanent blindness.
Oh, wow. And the antifreeze.
The same enzyme turns ethylene glycol into oxalic and glycolic acids. These form sharp calcium oxalate crystals that lodge in the kidneys, causing renal failure.
Okay, so if the enzyme is the traitor, how do we stop it?
We blockade the enzyme. The main antidote is fomepizole. It hugs the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme and blocks it. The harmless parent alcohols are then just peed out.
Wait, I read there's a surprisingly common alternative antidote if you don't have fomepizole.
There is regular ethanol.
You literally get them drunk to save their life.
Essentially, yes. The enzyme prefers ethanol. So if you flood the system with ethanol, the enzyme gets totally distracted, metabolizing it, completely ignoring the toxic alcohols until the kidneys excrete them.
That is amazing. Now, a quick clarification for the listener. Isopropanol rubbing alcohol is different, right?
Completely different. It's metabolized by the same enzyme, but it turns into acetone.
Like nail polish remover.
Exactly. And acetone doesn't oxidize further into an acid. No acidemia, no crystals, no blindness. Therefore, no fomepizole is needed.
So what's the treatment?
Just supportive care. They'll be heavily sedated, but they just sleep it off.
All right, let's pivot from liquids to invisible gases. Carbon monoxide and cyanide, often found together in house fires. Carbon monoxide, or KIO, we know it binds to hemoglobin. How strong is that grip?
About 230 to 270 times stronger than oxygen.
So it's stealing seats on the hemoglobin bus. Oxygen wants to sit, but CO shoved its way on first.
It's actually worse. Figure 44.7 shows how it alters the physical shape of the hemoglobin molecule. It forces the other occupied seats to grip their oxygen much, much tighter.
Wait, if blood holds oxygen tighter, isn't that good?
It's fatal. Red blood cells need to release oxygen to the organs. Because CO altered the shape, the blood holds onto it. The blood is full of oxygen, but the tissues are suffocating.
Oh, wow. So the organs are starving at an all-you-can-eat buffet.
Exactly. This trapping creates that classic cherry red skin color. Treatment is 100% oxygen or a hyperbaric chamber.
Okay, then there's cyanide. This one attacks the cell directly.
Yeah, cyanide halts cellular respiration. It binds to and inactivates cytochrome oxidase,
Right.
specifically cytochrome A3.
Which does what, normally?
It's the final step in turning oxygen into cellular energy. Even with oxygen present, the cells can't use it. Tissues like the brain and heart die rapidly.
So how do we fix it? The book talks about an old kit versus a new kit.
Right, the old kit used sodium nitrite and sodium thiosulfate. The nitrite intentionally changes normal hemoglobin into methemoglobin.
Why would we alter our own hemoglobin?
Because cyanide loves methemoglobin more than cytochrome A3. It acts as a decoy, pulling cyanide out of cells. Then thiosulfate helps process it out.
That sounds like a brilliant trap. But there's a flaw for house fire victims, isn't there?
A deadly flaw. Fire victims likely inhaled carbon monoxide. Their hemoglobin is already compromised. If you intentionally alter their remaining healthy hemoglobin into methemoglobin,
you completely destroy their remaining oxygen capacity. You cure the cyanide, but suffocate the patient.
Precisely. Which is why the new antidote is intravenous hydroxycobalamin, which is just vitamin B12A.
Oh, right.
Binds directly to cyanide to form cyanocobalamin regular vitamin B12, safely excreted in urine, totally bypassing the hemoglobin issue.
That is so elegant. Okay, let's look at heavy metals. Iron and lead, starting with iron. Table 44.8 shows this well.
Iron is tricky because it's in daily vitamins. A toddler eats prenatal vitamins, and it's a huge emergency. Toxicity depends on the salt fumarate. It's 33% elemental iron, sulfate is 20%, gluconate is 12%.
And it causes severe GI vomiting, progressing to shock and liver failure. How do we get it out? Charcoal doesn't work.
We use a chelator, diferoxamine. Think of it like a molecular claw. It circulates in the blood, grabs free iron, and creates a water-soluble complex the kidneys can filter.
I mean, you have to give it as a continuous infusion, right? Rapid thief pushes cause hypotension.
Exactly.
And then there's lead. Exposure is usually old paint, and the absorption stats between kids and adults are stark.
Devastatingly stark. Figure 44.9 outlines this. Adults absorb 10% of ingested lead. Kids absorb 40%. And the body confuses lead with calcium, so it hides it in the bones for 20 to 30 years.
A lifetime sentence. And at just 5 to 20 micrograms in kids, it causes a permanent drop in IQ, clumsiness, colic, and hypochromic microcytic anemia because it disrupts heme synthesis.
Thankfully, we have antidotes. Moderate levels in kids get oral Suxheimer or DMSA. Severe levels get dual IVM therapy, demercaprol, and calcium disodium edetate.
Is there an allergy catch here?
Yes, demercaprol is suspended in peanut oil. Do not give it to patients with a peanut allergy.
Crucial catch. Okay, shifting from metals to agricultural chemicals. Bug spray, nerve gas, organophosphates, and carbamates.
These inhibit an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase.
Let's break that down. Nerves use acetylcholine to send messages. Move a muscle, start sweating, then acetylcholinesterase acts like a street sweeper and cleans it up.
Right. But organophosphates destroy the street sweeper. The acetylcholine just builds up.
A massive chemical traffic jam, and that causes the muscarinic symptoms, the DUMBL's acronym.
Exactly. Diarrhea, urination, meiosis, pinpoint pupils, bradycardia, bronchorrhea, emesis, lacrimation, and salivation.
Plus nicotinic effects like muscle twitching and weakness.
Which is exactly how nerve gas works, just way faster.
So what's the dual antidote?
Atropine blocks the muscarinic receptors. And pralidoxime acts like a crowbar, prying the toxin off the enzyme to stop the muscle twitching.
Amazing. Okay, we are in the home stretch. Let's pull out the final cheat sheet, figure 44.10, rapid fire. What if someone takes too many benzodiazepines, like Valium?
The specific reversal agent is flumazenol.
And what if they overdose on anticholinergics and are hot, dry, and hallucinating?
For severe anticholinergic toxicity, the antidote is physostigmine.
Perfect. Let's apply this to the study questions. A 2-year-old swallows clonazepam, a benzo, unresponsive.
They need flumazenol.
A migrant field worker is brought in with DUMBL diarrhea, pinpoint pupils, drooling.
Organophosphate exposure. He needs atropine and pralidoxime.
A jeweler unconscious by a space heater, cherry red skin.
Carbon monoxide poisoning. 100% oxygen immediately.
And a patient with an anion gap acidosis and calcium oxalate crystals in their urine.
They drank ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. They need foampisol.
You know, tracing all these pathways, it's incredibly complex, but there is a profound elegance to it.
There really is. If you step back, toxicology is ultimately the study of balance. The very same mechanisms our bodies use to survive, enzymes breaking down liquids, hemoglobin carrying oxygen, are the exact pathways these toxins hijack.
It's just chemistry being weaponized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But understanding the physiology doesn't just explain the poison. It reveals the absolute genius of the antidote.
I love that. To the college students studying this for the first time, you've got this. Keep chasing the why behind the what's. Thank you so much for trusting us with this deep dive into pharmacology from the entire Last Minute Lecture team. See you next time.